Tonight, the Kremlin is accusing the US of an economic war on Russia, one day after President Biden's ban on Russian oil and other energy imports.
This is unprecedented that a large economy, 150 million people, has been literally walled off from the rest of the global economy within a matter of days.
Working in unison, Western governments have turned Russia into the most sanctioned nation in the world and sent their economy tumbling.
Дорогой фондовый рынок, ты был нам близок, был интересен. Покойся с миром, дорогой товарищ.
It's a complete 180. This is the end of an era of 30 years of integration.
The hope is that by crumbling Russia's economy, it will persuade Vladimir Putin to end his war in Ukraine.
The only thing that we can do with these sanctions is to bleed him dry so that there is no money left for him to execute this war. The estimates are that the GDP of Russia is going to contract by 30% immediately. 30% GDP contraction is the equivalent of the Great Depression that took place in America. It's going to be a savage, horrific effect on the Russian people, on the Russian economy, and on everything to do with Russia. There's not going to be a single person who's unaffected by what's coming.
Абсолютно полная изоляция от всего мира.
Да нормально будет все. Какие-то трудности будут,
In some respects, there's almost a shock and awe treatment with respect to some of these sanctions. You know, the stock market has been sort of seized up essentially since the day after the invasion. You've seen hundreds of companies, international companies, leave. So all of that, I think, has had an immediate effect on the economic fortunes of Russians.
Will it achieve the ends that are intended, which is to get Putin to stop waging war? I'm not so sure about that.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
The EU, UK, USA, and NATO partners are pouring military equipment and aid into Ukraine, but there's a limit to what they can offer.
Because the West has decided it doesn't want to engage militarily with Russia, another nuclear power, the only tool they've got left in the toolbox is sanctions. And they're going to hit them with sanctions as hard as they can.
The Russian oligarch crackdown continuing.
Russia's oligarchs, the elite owners and managers of industry, have been targeted. Their jets and boats impounded, their bank accounts frozen.
We're seeing evidence that really any Russian links are proving pretty problematic, whether that's in business or culture.
So I've been campaigning for 10 years to toughen up on Putin and to toughen up on Russian criminality in London. And I felt like I was knocking on a closed door, and then all of a sudden, in 2 weeks, everything that I've been trying to do for 10 years has become possible.
Bill Browder was once the largest foreign portfolio investor in Russia, but after blowing the whistle on massive corruption, he was targeted. His lawyer and friend Sergei Magnitsky was detained, allegedly beaten by guards, and refused medical care before dying in prison in 2009.
Well, London is to Russia as Hong Kong is to China. Every Russian who stole money, every oligarch, every corrupt official wants a safe place to keep that money. And London has a rule of law, it has property rights, and most importantly, nobody's going to ask any tough questions from law enforcement here.
For decades, Russian money was welcomed by lawyers, accountants, and politicians, even in the face of an alleged assassination and attempted assassination on UK soil.
Alexander Litvinenko's death from acute radiation sickness was slow and agonizing.
In 2006, former KGB officer Alexander Litvinenko, a fierce Putin critic, died after being poisoned. Then in 2018, former Russian military intelligence officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with the nerve agent Novichok in the English city of Salisbury. They lived, but a British woman who was exposed to the nerve agent died.
So the UK historically took no action against anybody for anything. You could kill people using nuclear materials and there would be no consequences. You could shut down a whole city with banned chemical weapons and there'd be no consequences. And so the UK has got a terrible reputation as far as permissive attitude towards Russian malfeasance.
The West's response to Russia's invasion to Ukraine has been much stronger than anything seen before. The UK, which was criticized for being slower than the EU and USA on sanctions, is now in line.
And I would argue that the British government is now acting appropriately toughly. And I'm the biggest critic of the British government when it comes to this, and I can say that I'm impressed with the sanctions that are now being imposed.
The invasion of Ukraine has caused outrage across Europe, and nations that once tried to economically integrate with Russia are taking action against President Vladimir Putin and his government.
I think he completely underestimated the appetite of Western governments to impose punishing sanctions. I think he thought not only would the war in Ukraine be as easy as annexing Crimea, that it would be over very quickly, but he did not count on unity amongst European countries as well as the US and the UK to impose punishing sanctions that would cost their economies as well as his.
They're looking at this incredible coalition, Pacific, Atlantic, you see the Japanese, the Australians, even jurisdictions like Switzerland that have historically stayed far away from this kind of thing are stepping into the game and away from the sidelines, which is just an amazing scene. So all of that suggests that we are in an unprecedented time. And so unprecedented time means that there's going to be incredible and unprecedented effects, frankly, both planned and unplanned. So I think that we need to look for both of those on the economic side and the political side as well.
The speed and unity of action by Western governments has caught some by surprise. After years of disagreement between European nations about how and if to engage with Putin's Russia, EU countries have been shocked into coalition.
The Western world has finally woken up to the threat that Russian President Vladimir Putin poses. And so the sanctions have been unprecedented in terms of hitting hard the Russian economy from every angle. Everything from freezing some of the Russian central bank's reserves, foreign currency reserves, to kicking Russian banks out of SWIFT, the financial messaging system, limits or bans on Russian oil and gas. The list goes on, and the goal really is to deal a devastating blow against the Russian economy.
Sanctions are really only as strong as the weakest link. If you have differences in designations, differences in who's being targeted, that you could clearly take advantage of that. Historically, the Europeans, including the UK pre-Brexit, have not been particularly aggressive on the enforcement front. In the EU side, sanctions implementation is done by Brussels, but enforcement is done by the 27 states, member states, independently. And of course, each state has different capacities, different political interests, and different concerns. And therefore, enforcement has been somewhat lacking compared to the United States. And so I'm concerned about whether we're going to get enforcement, which is actually where the teeth can actually come into sanctions.
I mean, look at the history of sanctions in the two most high-profile cases, Iran and North Korea. It hasn't worked at all. If anything, it's only strengthened the regime. So there is a real question about sanctions as a tool in a situation like this. Will it really work, or will they perversely strengthen Putin?
So Vladimir Putin doesn't care about sanctions against his officials. He doesn't care about sanctions against Russian state companies. He absolutely profoundly cares about sanctions against Russian oligarchs because those oligarchs hold his money. And you can just look at his reaction when the British government started talking about sanctioning oligarchs. That was the first moment when he started threatening nuclear war. It's the thing he cares most about. Vladimir Putin is a man who values money more than human life.
But not everyone agrees that President Putin can be targeted by going after his foreign assets.
There are many who think that there are oligarchs in the West that are essentially Putin's banker. But in reality, I've had other people tell me he doesn't need that. He has the entire Russian state at his disposal to use. He doesn't need someone else to be his banker because he has all these state-run companies that he can use the cash flow from to do whatever he wants.
And while targeted sanctions may not change Putin's mind, sanctions on the Russian economy are being felt by ordinary people.
The sanctions will essentially decimate the Russian middle class, which many believe is key to building some kind of democratic state. And I think there's an assumption that you inflict so much pain on ordinary Russians that they will rise up and demand changes or overthrow the government. And again, I think that underestimates Russian history and the power and of the Kremlin.
For Browder, sanctions don't need to have any higher ambitions than throwing a spanner in Putin's war machine.
It's a hugely expensive war. $1 billion, $2 billion a day is spent on this war. He doesn't have access to his central bank reserves. He doesn't have access to his oligarch capital. He doesn't have access to external financing. And the purpose of this is not to get somebody to change his mind. It's to make sure that he just doesn't have enough money to do it. And this is how we won the Cold War. We basically bled them dry, and we have to do that again.
How this all plays out isn't entirely clear because we've never been here before. Russia's now the most sanctioned country in the world, and it's at war. We have not been here before. So it'll be an interesting test case. Can you cripple an economy and starve it of the resources it needs to wage war? Well, that depends on a number of factors. If China comes in and bails out Russia with weapons and other financial support, then they could continue to wage this war for quite a while.
So I think the way that China could potentially aid Russia is by serving as a payment conduit, right? So Russian institutions, certainly the big ones, have essentially been shut off from the international community, but Chinese institutions, of course, haven't been. And there's no reason that you can't sort of funnel a payment from rubles to renminbi and then out if you go via Shanghai or Beijing or via Hong Kong dollars in Hong Kong. I'm not sure China wants to sort of risk their rise, their sort of soft power, on sort of getting into bed very, very closely and intimately with someone who is so reviled on an international basis.
If the US then responds with secondary sanctions on China for dealing with Russia, then that cuts out that other escape route that Putin potentially has. So the world is unified, but not entirely unified.